For years, Hollywood circled the National Lampoon crowd without committing to a movie. The magazine was sharp, profane, and built on humor that made studio executives nervous. When Universal finally said yes to a comedy carrying the brand, the production was working on a shoestring with a small budget, an untested director, and a campus most of America had never heard of. What came back was National Lampoon's Animal House, the picture that rewrote the rules of screen comedy. The making of it turned out to be as reckless as the movie itself, full of rejected scripts, vanished campuses, casts that almost were, fights that actually happened, and improv that changed careers. Number 1. The Manson comedy It Almost Was. The first version of the project wasn't set on a college campus, wasn't called Animal House, and wasn't even really a comedy in the shape the finished film would be. Doug Kenney and Harold Ramis, working through what kind of movie the National Lampoon brand could support, had drafted something far darker called Laser Orgy Girls. The setting was high school, the tone leaned closer to satire, and one of the gags reportedly involved a letter from Charles Manson, then still a household name from his trial, addressed to a former classmate from prison. Producer Maddie Simmons read the material and pushed back at almost every level. The high school setting felt wrong for what audiences would pay to sit through. The darker register sat uneasily against the studio's expectations for a comedy. The whole concept seemed to be reaching for something the brand probably couldn't carry into a major theatrical release. Simmons kept steering the writers toward a college setting instead, where the misbehavior could be louder and more recognizable without needing the same edge to land. That redirect ended up shaping everything that followed. The college version unlocked a different kind of energy, handed the writers a world audiences already understood, and set aside the prison gag along with the rest of the original concept. Once the move was made, the writers needed real campus material to draw from, and the answer was already sitting in someone's notebook. Number 2. The Real Frat Behind Delta. At Dartmouth in the early 1960s, Chris Miller had been a member of Alpha Delta Phi, a fraternity well known on campus for behavior that ranged from theatrical to genuinely chaotic. By the time he was writing for National Lampoon a decade later, those memories had become raw material. His magazine piece, The Night of the Seven Fires, pulled directly from real Alpha Delta Knights, and his nickname there, Pinto, eventually attached itself to one of the central characters in the screenplay. When the writing team began shaping the college version of the film, Miller's history gave the project something neither Kenney nor Ramis could supply alone. The story rhythms, the room dynamics, the way a fraternity could function as both refuge and instigator, all of that came out of his actual Alpha Delta experience rather than imagination. Several of the brothers in the script trace back, at least loosely, to people Miller had lived alongside, with names changed and behavior heightened for screen. The exaggeration mattered, because the finished movie isn't a documentary of his college years and was never trying to be. The fights are bigger, the parties wilder, and the consequences pushed past anything that would have actually unfolded at Dartmouth. What carried over was the flavor, the sense that a place like Delta House could feel real because, in some meaningful way, it had been. Number 3. Faber started as a parody. Years before the film reached theaters, National Lampoon's high school yearbook parody had introduced a fictional school, a fictional faculty, and a set of student archetypes the magazine would reuse in different forms over the following years. The piece had been a hit for the magazine in its own right and gave its writers a running shorthand for the kind of comic landscape they were good at. A version of the Wormer character was already in there, though he hadn't yet been promoted to college dean and the school itself was still a high school, rather than Faber College. The DNA was visible, the setting wasn't. When the screenwriters began building the world of Faber, they didn't lift names or scenes wholesale from the parody. The earlier material worked more like a starting bench of comic types, the bullying authority figure, the desperate striver, the all-American golden boy, that the screenplay then reshaped for an older setting and a longer arc. Most of what reached the screen had been substantially rewritten, with only the underlying archetypes carrying through from the magazine work that helped make the picture possible in the first place. Number 4. The SNL cast that got away. On screen, only one Saturday Night Live alum ended up in the finished film. On paper, the original casting wish list read almost like an SNL reunion. Chevy Chase, Bill Murray, Brian Doyle Murray, and Dan Aykroyd were all considered or pursued for major roles alongside John Belushi. And for a brief stretch, the production looked like it might absorb a sizable chunk of the late-night show's roster. Most of those names fell away for practical reasons. Some were locked into ongoing SNL commitments. Others were already attached to other film projects, and a few simply weren't sold on the script in its messy early form. Belushi was the one who broke through, partly because his manager pushed for it, and partly because his Bluto fit the writing in a way no other casting choice would have replicated. John Landis was also pulling against full SNL absorption from the director's chair, worried that the film would land in theaters as an SNL movie rather than a comedy that stood on its own merits, and that pressure quietly capped how many cast members from the show actually crossed over. The backup list got even stranger before the final casting locked. Meatloaf was floated as a possible Bluto, on the theory that his stage presence might carry the role even without comedy credentials. Jack Webb, of all people, was raised as a Dean Wormer option, the deadpan authority register from Dragnet mapped onto a frat-burning college administrator. Neither came close to happening, but their presence on the list says something about how unfinished the script still felt to everyone reading it. With a different sequence of yes and no answers, the picture audiences eventually saw could have looked entirely different in almost every speaking role. Number 5. 9 drafts nobody wanted. Universal couldn't agree on what kind of movie they were holding. The early drafts of the script came in messy, with too many characters, too many incidents, and a comic register the studio hadn't seen succeed at this scale before. Each round of notes asked for more focus, less anarchy, a clearer protagonist, and each round the writers pushed back against trimming the thing that made the project funny in the first place. The development process pulled in several hands. Harold Ramis brought in a separate fraternity treatment of his own that overlapped in spirit with what Kenny and Miller were drafting. Ivan Reitman, attached as a producer, helped combine the various threads into something that could plausibly be filmed. The team eventually moved through 9 drafts before Universal greenlit production, and even at the green light, executives were openly uncertain about what they had agreed to. The script the studio finally accepted was still considered messy, risky, and too outrageous by most of the people who had read it. That assessment turned out to be exactly correct, but only in the commercial direction nobody had predicted. The film became a runaway hit, and the long, painful development that had nearly killed it on multiple occasions ended up shaping the loose anarchic energy that audiences responded to. None of the trimming the studio asked for would have improved it. Number 6. Sutherland's $14 million regret. On screen, his presence gave the picture a kind of unspoken prestige. On the back end, it cost him millions. Donald Sutherland was the most established actor on the call sheet by a significant distance, with serious dramatic credits behind him, and a name that helped a low-budget college comedy look like something a major studio could plausibly back. When the offer came in, Universal gave him a choice: a flat fee for the few days of work playing Professor Jennings, or a small percentage of the film's gross. Sutherland took the cash. The flat fee was reasonable for a quick character part in a movie nobody expected to do much business, but the percentage would have been worth somewhere in the range of $14 million by the time the picture finished its theatrical run and the aftermarkets caught up. He has spoken about the decision since with the rueful tone of someone who had no real way to know what was about to happen, because nobody else on the production knew either. What his name did get the studio in the meantime was credibility, and that single piece of casting may have done more to keep the film alive in development than the contract itself ever earned him. Number 7. Wormer was cast from a Western. In a screening room before production began, John Landis was watching The Outlaw Josie Wales when one of the supporting performances caught his attention. John Vernon, playing the leader of a band of Union irregulars, was projecting a particular kind of cold authority Landis hadn't quite known he was looking for. The picture he was about to direct needed a Dean Wormer who could function as the immovable object the Delta crowd kept hurling themselves against, and most actors auditioning for the part were either pitching it broad or sliding into self-aware comedy. Vernon was doing something else. He was playing villainy completely straight, with no winking acknowledgement that the audience was meant to find any of it funny. Landis brought him in, and Vernon agreed to approach Wormer the same way. Dead serious, no comedy in his delivery, as if he had wandered in from a much grimmer movie and didn't realize the rest of the cast was working in a comedy. That choice ended up being the single most important casting decision in the picture. The chaos around Wormer only worked because he refused to participate in it, and lines that could have died as one-liners landed with real weight because the man delivering the dressing downs genuinely seemed to mean every word. Number 8. A pizza box made flounder. The pizza boxes started turning up at casting agents' offices in Los Angeles without any particular explanation. Inside each one, taped to the underside of the lid where it would be the last thing a hungry assistant noticed, was a headshot of a young actor named Stephen Furst with a phone number written across the bottom. Furst had been driving for a pizza place to pay rent while trying to break into film, and he had quietly turned every delivery to a casting office into a job application that nobody could quite throw away. The trick was simple in concept and ridiculous in execution. The headshot survived because the box itself was the package. Assistants opening lunch had no clean way to discard the photograph without first looking at it, and even casting directors who would have ignored a mailed packet eventually started recognizing the face. One of those offices was working on the film. Somebody finally picked up a phone, and Furst was called in to read for Flounder. The reading went well enough that he got the part, which made the role the one that put him on the map. Trade press at the time tended to describe it as his film debut, and the shorthand has stuck in some retellings ever since. But he had already shot a small comedy called American Raspberry the year before, and that one technically came first. What changed with Flounder wasn't his entry into film, but the size of the door it opened. The performance gave him a working career, and the pizza box stunt turned into the kind of audition story that gets retold whenever young actors ask how anyone breaks in. Number 9. Colleges wanted no part of it. School after school passed. Once the production had a script, a budget, and an approximate shoot window, location scouts began approaching universities about hosting the filming, and almost everyone they reached out to said no. The script was the problem. Most administrators read the material, weighed the publicity implications of a major Hollywood comedy filming a fraternity riot on their grounds, and politely declined to be associated with whatever the finished picture was going to look like. Estimates of the rejection count vary, but most accounts put it well over 20 institutions, with a handful pulling out late in the process after initial soft interest curdled into formal refusal. Some schools cited specific scenes, while others gave vaguer reasons that pointed in the same general direction. By the time the scouts were running out of plausible options, the production was facing a real possibility that no campus would be willing to play Faber College, and a comedy about American college life shot on rented sound stages with painted backdrops would have been a smaller and probably very different picture than the one audiences eventually saw. What the right campus would eventually give the film was the texture nobody could fake. Real ivy, real walking distances between buildings, a real lecture hall, a real fraternity row on a real autumn afternoon. Without that, it remains an open question how much of the movie's confident sense of place would have survived. The studio could probably have forced a version into theaters one way or another, but whether anyone would still be talking about it half a century later is a different question entirely. Number 10. Otter was built in improv class. In a small theater space in Los Angeles, Tim Matheson was standing on a bare stage with a circle of other actors, trying to make a scene work without any script in front of him. The groundlings classes he had signed up for were not where most people in his career bracket were spending their evenings. Matheson had been working steadily for years as a clean-cut leading man type, the kind of casting that came easily to him and that he was now actively trying to escape, and improv was the route he had chosen to do it. When word came through that the production was casting Otter, Matheson recognized the part as exactly the slot he had been training to fill. Otter was supposed to be smooth, slippery, and verbally faster than anyone around him, and most of the actors auditioning were reading the lines exactly as written. Matheson read them with the looser, more confident rhythm the improv work had given him. When the production paired him with Peter Riegert for a chemistry test, the two of them clicked quickly enough that the casting decision moved without much further deliberation. A lot of what the finished Otter sounds like on screen, the seduction patter, the confident speeches, the way he can talk a room into something it should know better than to agree to, comes directly out of that period of training. Matheson was no longer the well-mannered young lead the industry had cast him as for most of the previous decade. He was something faster and more dangerous, and the role gave him a runway into the next phase of his career. The audition that locked him in also brought Riegert into the picture, and Riegert wasn't the only newcomer the production was about to find. Number 11. 3 future stars began here. 3 young performers, none of whom audiences yet recognized, walked through the production's casting cycle and into the rest of their working lives. The first was Karen Allen, who had answered a casting notice for a small but visible part as Boone's girlfriend. She had done some theater work and a couple of television guest spots, but no significant film credits, and the role gave her her first major screen exposure. A few years later, she would be playing opposite Harrison Ford in Raiders of the Lost Ark, but at the moment she signed on for the production, she was still essentially an unknown actor, trying to put together a working career. Kevin Bacon's involvement was even smaller and even more accidentally consequential. The film gave him his first on-screen appearance, in a brief but memorable role as the eager-to-please pledge Chip Diller, including the sequence at the end where he stands in front of the parade chaos shouting that everyone should remain calm. He had no film credits going in. He left the production having shot his first scene in a major Hollywood movie, and within a few years, the career that traced back to that single bit of casting would become substantial enough to anchor a parlor game played by film fans for the next several decades. Peter Riegert, the third of the trio, took the role of Boone and brought a slightly older, drier presence into the cast. The role hadn't originally been written with him in mind. Harold Ramis, who had been one of the screenwriters from the project's earliest college set drafts, had quietly written Boone for himself, and for a stretch of development, it was understood that he would be playing the part. John Landis pulled the plug on that piece of casting late in the process, on the grounds that Ramis was now visibly too old to read as a college student on screen. Riegert took the part. Ramis stepped fully back into the writing and producing side of his career, and the role that should have been a creator's reward for years of development work went, almost as a footnote, to someone the writer's room had barely been thinking about. Number 12. The Oregon Dean Who Said Yes. In the spring before production was scheduled to begin, the University of Oregon's president, William Beatty Boyd, made the decision that effectively saved the picture. Most institutions location scouts had reached out to had already passed, often after concluding that nothing they could gain from hosting the shoot would offset what their alumni would think when the finished movie reached theaters. Boyd read the same material and came to a different conclusion. He told the production that Oregon could host the shoot on one specific condition. The word Oregon could not appear anywhere in the finished film. His reasoning, by his own later account, was partly informed by an earlier decision he had come to regret. Years before, working at a different institution, he had passed on hosting another major Hollywood production that turned out to be The Graduate. He was not going to make the same kind of judgment twice. Boyd accepted the condition about the school's name and signed off on letting Universal turn the campus into Faber College. The condition held up. The finished picture never names Oregon, and the school is identified only as Faber. Whatever institutional distance Boyd may have hoped to keep didn't. The cover of Shout the Deltas performed during the toga party became a fixture at Oregon football games in the years that followed, sung along to by tens of thousands of students who in many cases hadn't been born when the film was made, and a picture the dean had agreed to host on the strict understanding that nobody would know it was filmed there ended up one of the most recognizable cultural exports the school has ever had. Number 13, $3 million and no trailer. On the Eugene set, the director didn't have a trailer and didn't have an office. John Landis was working from whatever space was available, a folding chair by the camera, a desk in someone else's room when paperwork had to be handled, for most of the production. The budget didn't have room for the kind of physical infrastructure even modest studio films usually built around a director, and nobody pretended otherwise. The whole production was running on the same logic. The shoot was completed in roughly 4 weeks, with the Oregon agreement requiring the company to wrap within 30 days of starting, and the budget came in around $3 million. Low enough to make the studio's risk tolerable, even if the picture turned out to be exactly the messy disappointment they were quietly bracing for. Universal wasn't expecting a hit. They were expecting a curiosity, ideally a profitable one, and they had structured the production to limit the damage if it wasn't. The film's eventual box office performance retired that calculation entirely, but at the time of filming, nobody on the lot was treating the picture as a project worth investing real overhead in. Number 14, Belushi's wild weekly commute. By Friday afternoon, John Belushi was usually in the air. The shooting schedule had been built around his commitments to Saturday Night Live in New York, which meant that for a stretch of the production, he was filming in Eugene early in the week and flying east on Friday to make Saturday's broadcast, sometimes returning almost immediately to pick up the next round of scenes. Of all the SNL names floated during casting, he was the only one who actually crossed over, and he was paying the price for it on a weekly basis. The arrangement was unusual even by the standards of an industry that asks a lot of its leads. Most of the cast were able to live, work, and sleep within a half hour of each other for the duration of the shoot, falling into the kind of rhythm that builds chemistry on screen. Belushi was holding down 2 demanding jobs in 2 cities and trying to be fully present in both. John Landis later described the effort that went into keeping him on track, managing schedules, monitoring how much rest he was getting, and trying to limit the influences around him that were already starting to take a visible toll. By the standards of what would come later, the time he spent on the production stands out as one of his more focused stretches. The Belushi who reached the film's release a few months later was a different working presence than the one who would carry the weight of his own celebrity over the years that followed, and what those Eugene weeks would have looked like without the pressure of both jobs at once is anyone's guess. Number 15, the real frat fight on set. The party was supposed to be friendly. One of the actual fraternities on campus had invited the Delta cast over for a night, the kind of cross-pollination Eugene's social calendar made easy, and that the production had no reason to discourage. The actors went, the way working 20-somethings would, expecting some beer and a few hours away from the shoot. What they walked into was something else. The hostility was already in the room when the cast arrived, and it didn't dissipate. At some point in the evening, the situation escalated past words and into a physical fight that had real consequences. Bruce McGill came out of it with a black eye. James Widows had teeth knocked loose. Whatever pretense of social neutrality the night had started with was gone, and the actors who had walked in expecting an easy evening walked back to their accommodation, having taken injuries from people who were not supposed to be hostile to them in the first place. It is a strange detail to sit with, and one that the surrounding comedy of the production tends to flatten in the retelling. What's striking is what the production did with the fallout. John Landis took the social tension the fight had exposed and treated it as a working asset. For the rest of the shoot, he kept the actors playing deltas and the actors playing omegas separated when the cameras weren't rolling, on the theory that the antagonism between the 2 groups would read better on screen if the cast wasn't socializing across the line. The injuries faded. The on-screen tension between the fraternities, which is one of the things the picture handles best, was at least partly built on a real night that nobody had planned for. Number 16. The parade became a war zone. The film doesn't end at the fraternity house. It ends in the middle of a town parade, with the Deltas dismantling everything around them in front of an entire community that had thought it was about to enjoy a respectable afternoon. That structural choice was the script's biggest swing, and it's the one that turned the picture from a campus comedy into something with a wider target. For most of the running time, the conflict had been internal to Faber. Deltas against Omegas, Deltas against the dean, Deltas against the institution that wanted them gone. The parade scene moved the fight outside those walls and into the kind of public civic ritual the film had so far left alone. Marching bands, banners, polished uniforms, and a crowd of townspeople who had nothing to do with the fraternity feud all become moving targets. The Deltas pick apart in real time. The pacifist drum corps gets ambushed. The reviewing stand gets torn apart. The parade route becomes a war zone in the most literal sense the comedy will allow. The choice to expand the chaos that far worked because the picture had spent 90 minutes earning permission for it. Audiences had watched the Deltas lose enough fights with authority that the wholesale destruction of a public ceremony read as catharsis rather than cruelty. The film's last act rewrites the conflict as one between the Deltas and respectable society itself, and the closing image, credits playing over the smoking ruin of an event the town and the school had organized in good faith, was the punctuation the story had been building toward all along. Number 17. One take started a food war. Trays rose into the air and hit walls as the cafeteria sequence got going. John Landis had told his actors to commit fully and not hold back. The scene was going to be loud, messy, and built on the kind of energy you can't easily fake in a second take if everyone is standing in a room they have to clean up afterward. The camera stayed loose. The cast played the room like a real fight that had just stopped being verbal. And most of the chaos that reached the screen came from people throwing themselves into the moment without much choreography. The single most famous beat in the sequence wasn't even in the script. John Belushi, watching the room come apart around him, took a mouthful of mashed potatoes, slammed his cheeks together, and announced to the room that he was a zit. The camera stayed on him through the whole gag. The moment nobody had written became the line of the scene, and the food fight was something the film couldn't afford to reshoot anyway. What ended up on screen was essentially the first version anyone caught on camera, and the cafeteria fight has been one of the most quoted comedy sequences from the era ever since. Number 18. Belushi invented Pearl Harbor. In the basement of the Delta House, the morale of the room had collapsed. The fraternity had just been shut down. Most of the brothers were sitting on furniture they no longer technically owned, looking at one another for the kind of leadership nobody had ever expected them to provide. Belushi's Bluto, who had been operating throughout the picture as something closer to chaos in human form than any kind of strategist, picked himself up off the floor and started to give a speech. What came out was the famous line about whether it was over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor. The historical reference was wrong. The energy the line carried was correct. The script the writers had handed Belushi sketched the speech in broad strokes, and most of the comic force the moment now carries came from his specific delivery. The certainty in the voice, the conviction that the example was both rousing and accurate, the willingness to sell every word without a flicker of self-awareness. Tim Matheson and Peter Riegert, playing Otter and Boone, do most of the work of framing the scene around him. Their reactions don't stop Bluto, but they acknowledge the absurdity just enough to make the speech land harder. The Pearl Harbor speech wasn't the only memorable moment in the picture that came together in the room rather than on the page. Verna Bloom, playing Marion Wormer, spent her drunken couch scene with Otter, improvising her way through a sequence the script had only roughly outlined. The slurred timing, the way she keeps almost falling asleep mid-sentence, the half-coherent delivery of lines that were never quite written that way. Most of it came from Bloom finding the character in the moment. Several of the picture's best-remembered scenes ended up working that way, with the script as a starting point and the actors finishing the writing on the day. Number 19. Richard Pryor saved the club scene. Universal didn't know what to do with one scene in particular. The Dexter Lake Club sequence, in which the Delta brothers walk into a black-owned roadhouse expecting hospitality and very quickly realize they've miscalculated the room, made the studio nervous in ways the rest of the picture didn't. Executives weren't sure how it was going to play with audiences, weren't sure whether the scene's comedy was finding the right note around its racial dynamics, and were openly considering cuts. John Landis took the unusual step of arranging a private screening for Richard Pryor, who at that point was at or near the peak of his cultural authority on questions of comedy and race. Pryor sat through the picture, watched the Dexter Lake sequence, and gave the scene his approval. He told Landis the moment was funny, it played correctly to him, and the studio should keep it. That endorsement from someone Universal could not credibly second-guess on the subject ended the internal debate. The scene stayed in. Audiences responded to it as one of the picture's stronger, uncomfortable road trip moments, with the comedy resting on the cluelessness of the white characters rather than at anyone else's expense. And over the years, it has held up better than several other scenes from comedies of the same era. None of that was guaranteed when the studio was thinking about cutting it. A single screening and the agreement of one viewer whose opinion carried more weight than the entire executive team's was what kept the scene in the finished film. Number 20. The horse gag fooled everyone. For decades, plenty of viewers walked away from the film convinced something terrible had happened to a horse on screen. The scene in Dean Wormer's office, in which the Delta crew smuggles a horse into the room, fires what appears to be a starting pistol near it, and watches the animal immediately collapse, was edited and scored to read as something much darker than what was actually shot. Generations of audiences took the gag at face value and felt terrible about it for the rest of the runtime. What happened on set was almost the opposite of what the cut implies. The horse was unharmed at every point of the production. The pistol was loaded with blanks, the animal's reaction was a separate piece of footage shot under controlled circumstances, and the audio of the collapse was added in post. Landis's direction had the comedy depending on sound design, editing rhythm, and the kind of comic implication an audience completes in its own head. The off-screen follow-up with someone reaching for a measuring tape and a chainsaw was deliberately constructed to push the implication just past plausible deniability, to the point where viewers were laughing at themselves for taking it seriously in the first place. The horse, by various accounts, was the highest-earning member of the production crew on a per-day basis. Animal performers of that level command serious fees, and the rates for the kind of trained, calm, on-cue work the gag required were considerably higher than what most of the human cast members were making for their hours. The animal supposedly killed in front of Dean Wormer was billing more per shoot day than several of the people who looked surprised when it dropped. Number 21. The lost hour nobody saw. Roughly an hour of footage didn't make it into the finished film. The first assembly cut John Landis screened was long enough to need significant trimming, and by the time the picture reached theaters, the version audiences saw was tighter, leaner, and missing several moments the editing room had left on the floor. Some of those cuts were obvious choices. Others have spent decades as the kind of trivia answer that surfaces every few years when someone goes looking for the lost material. Among the deleted moments, two stand out for fans who have followed the picture's edit history. Landis himself appeared in a brief cafeteria cameo that was cut from the theatrical version, the kind of director's joke he liked dropping into his films, and that this one didn't have room for. A scene built around D-Day at a draft board medical examination was filmed but ended up on the cutting room floor, taking with it some of the more pointed material the script had drafted for that character. The reasons for both cuts came down to pacing more than content. The picture was already overflowing with incident, and the editor was looking for places to cut weight without losing the story. What did survive the trimming was the structural choice that may have done more for comedy formatting than the rest of the cuts combined. The "Where Are They Now?" epilogue cards, freezing each character on screen and adding a one-line caption about their post-college fate, were planned from very early in the project and made it through every round of editing intact. The device became a template that countless comedies have borrowed since. Not all of the picture's lasting echoes ran through the editing room, though. Some traveled out beyond the cuts entirely, into the lives of the people who had worked on the production, and one of those threads led somewhere nobody on set could have predicted. Number 22. A smashed guitar became a hit. On the Staircase set, Stephen Bishop was holding a guitar he had brought to the production himself, waiting for John Belushi to take it away from him. Bishop, by then a working singer-songwriter with 2 records and a real career going, had been cast for a small role as the folk-singing student on the staircase whose performance Bluto interrupts. The bit only worked if the guitar was actually smashed on camera, and Bishop had agreed to play the moment for real. Belushi did the take, the guitar broke, and Bishop walked off set with what was left of the instrument in his hands. His involvement with the picture went well past the staircase scene. Bishop ended up performing the song that plays over the opening credits. His voice, the first thing audiences hear before the picture, has even introduced its first character. He kept one of the smashed guitar pieces from the staircase, and the cast signed it for him, making the wreckage a memento from the production. For a singer-songwriter who had taken a small acting role mostly as a favor and a curiosity, Bishop walked away with both a credit on a song that helped define the picture's tone and a piece of cast-signed wreckage that has followed him through his career since. Karen Allen, one of the unknown actors the production had brought into Hollywood for the first time, ended up dating Bishop for several years after the film wrapped. The relationship eventually ended, and the breakup left Bishop with material he turned into a song. That song, Separate Lives, became a hit when Phil Collins and Marilyn Martin recorded it as a duet for the soundtrack of White Nights, and it earned Bishop an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Song. The path from a smashed prop guitar in a college comedy to an Oscar-nominated ballad sung in a Cold War drama isn't one anyone could have plotted from the staircase set, but the picture's casting had quietly seeded it the day Bishop and Allen met on the production. Number 23. Blues Brothers began in Eugene. When I met him, he didn't know anything about the blues, Curtis Salgado told interviewers in the years that followed, recalling the night John Belushi first walked into a club in Eugene to hear him play. Salgado was performing with the Robert Cray Band at the time, fronting a working blues outfit on the Pacific Northwest circuit, and the actor showed up out of the audience with the kind of curiosity that suggested he had picked the gig up as a tip from someone on the production. What Salgado expected, by his own account, was a quick brush with a celebrity passing through town. What he got was a several-month conversation. Belushi started showing up regularly. He came back to the club to hear Salgado play. He asked about songs, asked about players, asked about which records to start with and which ones to chase down once the obvious ones were behind him. Salgado put together listening homework, walked him through the catalog, pointed him at the artist whose work would matter most. By the time the production wrapped and Belushi left Oregon, he had absorbed enough of the canon to start performing the music himself. What came out of those nights in Eugene took shape on Saturday Night Live not long afterward, when Belushi and Dan Aykroyd debuted the act that became the Blues Brothers. The full mythology of Jake and Elwood, the suits, the dark glasses, the touring band, the eventual feature film, all of it grew from the time Belushi spent learning the form, and Salgado's foundational role has been acknowledged on the record by both Belushi at the time and Aykroyd in the years since. The Eugene shoot gave the actor a second act, and once the film itself was in theaters, the picture's own cultural reach started running well past anything its creators had planned. Number 24. The toga craze took over. Bedsheets started disappearing from college dorms across the country. The pattern began almost as soon as the picture reached theaters and didn't ease up for months. Universal had spent significant marketing budget on the release, including organized promotional toga parties on campuses, betting that turning the film into a participatory event would drive ticket sales harder than conventional advertising. The bet worked. The University of Wisconsin-Madison hosted the most famous of the campus parties, a sprawling event that drew thousands of students and fed straight back into more ticket sales. Similar parties happened on hundreds of other campuses through the spring of the release year. The picture was no longer just a movie audiences had seen. It was a thing they had attended. Decades later, an Australian university hosted a toga party explicitly inspired by the Animal House parties of the late 70s, and the event was certified by Guinness World Records as the largest toga gathering ever assembled. A bedsheet and a few hours of audience participation had become a record-breaking phenomenon long after the marketing budget had been spent. Number 25. Niedermeyer escaped the movie. Mark Metcalf only spent a handful of minutes on screen in the picture. The character somehow lasted decades. Niedermeyer was the ROTC commander whose every appearance was built around making the audience want to see him face consequences, and the type of performance Metcalf had given turned out to be portable enough that he kept getting hired to do variations of it for years. Twisted Sister put him in two memorable music videos of the 1980s, casting him as the abusive father figure in We're Not Gonna Take It and I Wanna Rock as a direct continuation of the Niedermeyer persona. The videos worked because audiences already knew exactly what kind of authority figure they were watching get demolished. Stephen Furst made a brief cameo in I Wanna Rock that extended the production's cast crossover into the music video world for one chorus. Even John Landis got in on the joke. In Twilight Zone, the movie, the director worked in a sly nod to Niedermeyer's epilogue card from the original film, gesturing toward the character's eventual fate as if the running gag deserved one more punchline. A character who should have stayed in the closing credits had instead become a recurring symbol of the kind of authority figure the era was happy to keep watching get knocked down. Number 26. Pfeiffer's forgotten TV role. The picture's success made a television spin-off inevitable. ABC ordered Delta House for the 1979 season, picking up some of the original cast, including John Vernon as Wormer, Stephen Furst as Flounder, and James Widows as Hoover, and replacing the others with younger actors who could be plausibly written as continuing fraternity life at Faber. Among those younger actors was a then-unknown Michelle Pfeiffer, cast as a recurring character in what would become one of her earliest television credits. The shorthand version of this story has often called the show her acting debut, but that isn't quite right. Pfeiffer had already appeared on Fantasy Island and a few other television productions before Delta House started shooting, so the show was an early stop on her career, but not literally the first one. What it did give her was steady visibility on a network primetime show during the period when she was actively trying to build a working resume, and the role traveled with her name through the casting decisions that followed. Delta House didn't last. The network struggled to translate the picture's anarchic energy into family-friendly broadcast television, and the show was canceled after a single season. Two competing networks attempted similar fraternity comedies in the same period, and both failed faster than Delta House had. A theatrical sequel was kicked around as well, this one reportedly set during the 1967 Summer of Love, but the project never made it past development. The picture's cultural moment turned out to be a thing the original film had captured exactly once, and not a formula anything else could reproduce. Number 27. The Cliff That Ended a Genius. In Hawaii, in the late summer of 1980, Doug Kenny was found dead at the bottom of a cliff. He was 33 years old. The circumstances of the fall were never fully resolved, and contemporaneous coverage tended to use the kind of language that points in more than one direction without committing to any particular reading of what had happened. He had gone to Hawaii, in part to step away from the Hollywood pressure that had built up around him in the years since the picture's success, and the trip had been arranged in part by friends who were trying to get him out of an environment they recognized was not doing him good. Kenny had been one of the central creative voices behind the project from its earliest stages. The dark high school version of the script he and Harold Ramis had drafted years before had been the seed the production grew out of, and the comic sensibility he had developed across his work at National Lampoon shaped not just this film, but a substantial portion of the comedy that came out of his circle in the late 70s. He had also been a person, in the round sense, with friendships, vulnerabilities, working habits, and a kind of comic intelligence the people who knew him have spent decades trying to describe accurately. The death cut that work off in the middle of a sentence. John Belushi died 18 months later, also young, also in circumstances that have been written and rewritten about since. The two deaths arrived close enough together that the picture and the cultural moment around it have always carried a shadow the film itself, watched in isolation, doesn't necessarily contain. The comedy reached audiences as a riot. The lives behind it ran on a different timeline, one the picture's afterlife has had to absorb gradually since. There is no clean way to end the story the picture tells about itself. The Deltas got their epilogue cards. Two of the people who made it possible never got the equivalent on screen. It started as a script nobody trusted, on a campus nobody else would host, with a budget too small for a director's trailer. National Lampoon's Animal House came out of all of that and quietly rewrote what a college comedy could be. Careers launched off the cast list. Whole campuses borrowed the costume and the soundtrack. American comedy bent toward the picture's anarchy for a decade afterward. Underneath all of it, the people who made the film possible aged unevenly with what they had built, with some of the strongest voices in the room gone before the picture was even a decade old. If you've gotten this far, hit like and subscribe so the next deep dive into Hollywood's stranger backstories finds you when it drops. Drop a comment letting me know which of these secrets surprised you most or which scene you'll never watch the same way again.